and made it float on our ocean surface. So I'm going to show you how to do this. This is how it looks. I just modified a few things about the scene. The water material is the same, but I used a star-filled image for the background instead. So if I just show you how that looks, in the luminance channel, we have this image right here. And I just run this through a filter, which is with the gamma set to 0.5 and this colorize switch to turn it into a black and white image. And the fog is largely the same or similar to what we've been doing up to this point, just a blue colored fog with a start height of -2000 and an end height of 2000. Density set to 10%. And then just using this image right here as the material for my moon object, that's how I was able to create this style. So let's now go over the technical setup for having an object, any object, float on top of our ocean simulation. And if I go to the Hot 4D plugin, let's change the wave height to, let's say, 200. So quite extreme here. And you can see our object will react to that. When these waves come in from underneath, it raises the object. It's as if it was really floating on top of there. So let's go back a few steps and start this setup once again. I will also go to options and layer color so we can just see a bit easier what's going on in our scene. Let's get a sphere, and I'm going to set the size to 700 by 700, or just a radius of 350. And I want to move this to roughly the position I want it to be attached to the ocean surface. So I just brought it closer to our camera and set its position to -500 centimeters. Looking through our camera, this is the kind of view that we get. Then, whilst holding the Alt key, I'm going to insert a new null object. And by holding the Alt key, when I insert a new object, it will automatically become a parent of the object I had selected and inherit the same coordinates. So the position and rotation properties will be inherited onto the new parent automatically. So our new null is in the same spot as the sphere. And so this is the null object I am going to use to anchor this sphere to a particular point on our ocean. So if I call this anchor, let's then right click and go to rigging tags, and we want to find this constraint. In older versions of Cinema 4D, this would have been under character tags, but in version 21, it's been moved to rigging tags. The menu looks slightly different. Anyway, either way, you want to find this constraint tag. So let's bring that in. We want to go to the constraints. This is in the options of this tag, and we want to enable clamp. This is going to create a new tab. Let's navigate to that. And we want to clamp our moon to the surface of the ocean. So this to control, let's change it from origin to surface. And the target surface is going to be our ocean. So we need to drag this plane and place it into this target link box. And when I do that and just scrub through my timeline, now I can see our sphere moving up and down with the motion of the waves. So that's the basic setup of attaching any object to the surface of another one. And by the way, the reason I attached the constraint tag to the null object instead of directly to the sphere is because I can keep the anchor point and then go to the sphere itself and change its relative position to the anchor. So if I want more of this object to be above the surface, I can move it up. And because the anchor is above, it will still be attached at that point. But now I can see more of my object. So that's the reason of separating the anchor from the actual object itself. One other control we need to set here is in the clamp. We need to lock the position. So that's this control right here. And this is going to make sure that our object does not continuously drift away from its initial anchored point. So it will always stay in that same spot whilst just reacting to the waves that move past. If this is left unticked, you may notice a difference where the object slowly drifts, and then that's going to break the loop illusion. Anyway, let me now show you how I did the shading for the moon. If I enable the interactive renderer once again, and let's go to our images folder and get our moon texture, I am going to just apply this to the moon. And let's say we want to view a different part of the image. We can rotate it. I quite like this here. Right now I can see the default light is turned on. So let's insert a new light and set its intensity all the way down to 0. And then I'm going to get an infinite light, which is omnidirectional, which means it will only appear from the direction that it's pointing from. So as I move it about, you can see the effects on our moon object. I want to create this kind of look where it's mostly lit at the surface that we are looking at. Something like this perhaps, and I can go to the light and set its intensity to 150 just to really brighten this. And to make sure that our moon is the only thing being lit by this light, we want to go to the Project tab and drag the sphere into this and change the mode from exclude to include. So this is the only object now being affected by this light. So that's a quick tip. If you want certain lights to only affect certain objects, you want to use this Project tab and then use this include or exclude menu to target specific objects. Anyway, to continue, we have a specular or highlight on our moon material. So let's jump in here. It's in the reflectance channel, so let's just switch off the default specular. It's going to create something that looks more evenly lit. So this would be one approach to lighting this scene using an infinite light. Alternatively, we could continue without using any lights and just use the luminance channel in our material. If I turn off the infinite light, go to our material and move this from the color channel to luminance instead. It's much flatter because there is no directional light from the sun, but maybe that might look preferable. Let's put up the brightness and then set the blending mode to multiply. Maybe drop this down to 125. So I just wanted to give you another idea of what you can do with a project like this, and from a technical point of view, now you also know how to attach one object to the surface of another one. In the next lesson we'll be finishing up. We are going to export our animation from Cinema 4D. Once our animation is finished, the next step is to render it and export it out of Cinema 4D. So before we run the final export, let's smooth out our ocean surface here. In the original, I did that with a subdivision surface. So if I bring that in, I will set the subdivision in the editor to be 0. And in the renderer, let's leave it on 2. The reason it's set to 0 in the editor, which is what we're looking at right now, is because when I drop this in here, if it were subdivided by 1, it would be a much heavier scene. So let me just illustrate that very quickly. If I put 1 in here, you can see it subdivides the mesh and then smoothes it over. So whilst that looks nicer, it's now not as responsive as before. So we don't really need to see this in the preview. We can just leave this at 0, but when it renders out, it will be subdividing 2 times actually, so it's going to be even smoother. Let's do a quick comparison with and without. So if we turn it off for a moment, on this frame it's going to look like this. Let's re-enable it. So this is now, and this is before. You can just see it smoothes over these lines and swells on our ocean. Next up is our render settings. So if we jump in here, go to anti-aliasing, let's render with the current default settings, and then we can do a comparison. So that takes about 5 seconds, not too bad. And in the anti-aliasing, let's change this from geometry to best and leave the default settings 1x1 for the minimum level and max level 4x4 with a threshold of 10%. And if I re-render, you can see it would take longer this time, but that's because our render is going to look smoother. So zoomed in at 800%. This is with the best anti-aliasing settings, or the anti-aliasing set to best. And then this is prior to that with the default geometry setting. You can see the pixels are much rougher around the edges compared to this, which looks a lot smoother. So that's the effect of bumping up our anti-aliasing. So it now goes to, 8 seconds a frame, which is still very acceptable speed. So it's a trade-off between render speed and quality. I would recommend going to at least 1x1 and 2x2. That's going to give you a cleaner looking image, but 4x4 is going to be even cleaner. And a lower threshold of, let's say, somewhere between 5 and 10% is going to clean up a few more pixels. You don't want to have these settings too high, because at a certain point you start to experience diminishing returns, which means your render times will be significantly longer for not such a significant increase in quality. So it's just about finding that balance. If you're not ever sure about what anything in Cinema 4D means, you can always right-click it, go to Show Help, and Cinema 4D comes with some excellent documentation, which is filled with these illustrations and screenshots. It really goes into great detail what every single thing is. So it's a great tool, which even to this day I still find myself using, just because there's so many things to learn in Cinema 4D, and even after years of using the program, there's still some things I come across once in a while, and I have to find out what they are. Anyway, let's continue with our output. If we go to the output tab, this is going to be 1920 by 1080 at a frame rate of 24. And the frame range is going to be changed to all frames this time. So this is going to export our entire animation. Let's go to the Save tab and enable this. We had previously disabled it whilst just doing some renders to the picture viewer. Now we actually want to save this. So the format is going to be PNG. It's going to be 16-bit so that our image contains more information, which is going to be useful when we get to the After Effects section. We can then specify a save path, and this is in the tutorial folder, and I've created a separate folder just for this. I'm going to go into that folder and just call this main. So this is going to be our main render. And once that's done, we can now export our animation. And there are 2 ways to do this. Okay, there's going to be a cut here because my Cinema 4D crashed. So I've had to relaunch and just pause the recording for a moment. But anyway, once all of our settings are done, we can render to the picture viewer and watch the render in this window. Or we can use the render queue, which is my preferred method for outputting files in Cinema 4D. So if I go to render and add to render queue, we can see our render is here along with other previous projects which I also outputted prior to this. But if I had multiple projects, I can line them all up at once. So that's one of the reasons I use the queue, because I can leave the queue exporting and go and do something else in the meantime, or maybe render this overnight. Anyway, when it's ready, I just go to start rendering. And after a few seconds, we see our first frame. We can actually double click this to open up the full preview. And it also gives us an estimated time of completion. And for my scene, that's going to be about 1 hour and 20 minutes. So that's quite fast for an 18-second animation. I can step away from my workstation for a while. And when I come back, it will be finished. And that's it for the render and output settings from Cinema 4D. In the next lesson, we'll take those rendered frames into After Effects. In After Effects, we're going to apply a few effects and also some color adjustments, and this is just the finishing touches to the whole project. In After Effects, we're going to start by importing our sequence from Cinema 4D, so let's double-click the import window. And this is the folder it went to. If I just click any one of these and then make sure that PNG sequence is ticked, I can click import and After Effects will automatically detect the entire sequence. If you haven't changed the setting, by default After Effects is going to interpret this sequence at 30 FPS. I can see mine is already at 24, but if it's not, go to Interpret Footage. So right click, Interpret, and Main. And in here we want to assume a frame rate of 24. And then let's drag this to a new composition button. We can preview the whole thing. So I've lowered the quality here to, let's say, half. Press the spacebar just to quickly preview the entire animation. We can see it loops seamlessly, which is exactly what we want. If I just bump up the quality to full and just check the first frame, it's identical to the last frame in our animation, so we are going to remove this first frame. So if I go back to 0, press page down, and then press B to set this as the new beginning for this composition, I can then right click and then trim comp to work area. So this is now our starting point. If we leave that extra frame in, it means that each time we play this loop back to back, it's actually a bit longer than it should be. So we want to make sure to take that out. Anyway, let's move on. In the comp, let's open up the color management settings. Let's go to project working space and just make sure that we are working in 16 bits per channel, which is the same color depth we rendered out of Cinema 4D. And my working space here is set to this sRGB profile, which is actually the same as the profile on my monitor. So I know that my colors here will stay consistent from Cinema 4D to what I am looking at right now. Anyway, for the actual compositing, I really didn't do too much in After Effects. I just had a couple of adjustment layers with some glow effects and then a bit of color grading. So starting with some glow, let's go to Effect, Stylize, and Glow. This is on a adjustment layer. Let's go to the threshold and put this all the way up to 100%. So this is the first layer of glow. It's really more prominent down here on the ocean surface. The highlights from the reflection of the sun, if we enable glow, they just end up popping a bit more. So we might not want to have this so strong up here. Let's just see the before and after. It's not too drastic, but what I might do is create a mask for the ocean surface, just cutting the image in half like this. This is on our adjustment layer. Let's press F to bring up the feathering and then set this to, let's say, 250 or so to make the transition between where the effect will be applied and the sky to be, like a fade, basically. Okay, let's create another adjustment layer. And this time, still using glow, we are going to push the threshold quite high once again. But the radius this time is going to be much larger. So if I just grab this and just, let's say, to about 400%. And really that's all I did as far as applying a few post effects. Of course, your own scene is probably different, especially if you've used a different background image. I'm just showing you how I applied it to my scene. Anyway, the final thing here is some color adjustments, and I'm going to be using the Lumetri color effect. This is found under color correction and Lumetri color. And in here, I mostly want to warm up my image. So if I go to the basic correction, in the temperature, I'm going to set this up to about 40 or so. That's going to warm up all of the tones in my image. Below that, we have the tint, which if we go to the right, it's going to make it more purple. And then if you go to the left, it's going to be a bit more green. So I'm going to set this to about -10 or thereabouts. So just a quick before and after. That's the difference. One more section we can play with is the curves section, which if you scroll down is this right here. So if we open it up, and these hue and saturation curves in particular, I find quite useful. Let's say the hue versus hue slider. We can use this to change the tone of any color in the frame. So let's say we have a lot of yellow tones. If we put some handles either side of those tones on this graph here, we can select those colors only and make some adjustments. So maybe make the yellows a bit more orange by going in this direction. It's a subtle change, but there was a slight difference there. If I want to make it more obvious, let's use the reds as an example. So if I put another handle either side of red, I can take this red handle and then move it up and down, and you can see the difference. So if you find yourself not liking any particular tones in your image, you can target them using these curves and make the adjustments. So hue versus hue adjusts the colors. Hue versus saturation, which is above that, this is going to adjust the saturation of any color range you select. And below that, we